So what we did yesterday was we created the login page, the login route, and what this allows us to do is you type in your username and your password, and all it does is it just redirects to the home page or the root route at this time. Okay, so let's take off from here and let's introduce a couple of more features as we go along before we get to the main highlight, which is building the browser where we can see all the film strips. Now, my first point of attack would be the profile component. Now, if I go back to the login page, you'll notice that we have a profile component here, which shows the name of the logged in user, as well as it shows a logout button, which both of these are non-functional right now, right? The name is hard coded in. This could be anything that you want. This could be, Sachin here for the, for all that I care. But we need to pick this data from the API call that we have made to the server, and we need to pick this from the global state where it is sitting once you do a login. And if for some reason this data is not available, then the profile component should not render at all, right? So let's work on that first. Now, to make this happen, what we need to do is we need to query our global state to see if we are actually logged in or not. Once again, to verify if we are logged in, all we need to do is check the value of, one second, I'll show you. Check the value of the user property in this state. If this is not null, then it means that we have a user who's logged in, right? So that's what we'll try and set up today. So first up, first order of business is let's get our use global state hook. Okay, let's get this in. And I'm also going to import another hook called use context, which will essentially allow me to consume the context which we are getting from the use global state hook, right? So let's get this in. Now in a profile component, what we'll do is we'll first grab the state context. Remember, this is the pipeline that I was talking about. This is what provides access to everything. So let's first grab this from the use global state hook. You'll notice that I have to execute the function in order to get this, and that is because the hook itself is a function. So until you actually execute this, you won't get access to the context, or for that matter, the state provider. That's the signature of hooks, right? So once we get our context, in order to consume the context, in order to get things out of the context, for example, getting access to the state object and the dispatch function, what we'll need to do is we'll need to use the use context hook and simply supply the state context like so, right? So once we get this, let's make a couple of changes over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just cut this portion out, and we'll say that if state.user is present, if that is the case, then what we need to do is we need to render a pair of fragment operators. And the reason I'm doing that is because I need to render at this point, I need to render two elements, right? I need to render the name of the user, and I need to render the button which will allow me to log out, right? And if that is the case, this should happen. And if that is not the case, then simply return back a null, right? So simply return back a null, and that is what matters right now. So if I'm not logged in, then it should not render the name of the user. In fact, the name will not be present in the state. So don't render anything, and do not render the profile button as well, right? So this is what we have said here. But obviously, once we are logged in, how do we get the name? So it's simple, state.user in our case. So once we are logged in, we'll get the name by querying the state.user, and this will basically get the value of the state property over here. Because once you do the login, our reducer actually ends up setting the value of the user property. So we get that and we display it over here. This is done. Now, how do you create a logout? Well, the logout is simple. All you need to do is run an action that will result in this case getting executed, where all you're doing is you're setting the user property back to null. Null means no user is logged in. Okay. So to get that done, I'll create a function here. Let's create a function called, let's call this do logout. And all that this function does is it says dispatch. And what are we dispatching? We are dispatching an action of the type log out. And this string, what you mention here as the value of the type, should reflect the case that you have put here in the reducer. So in this case, logout is the case that I need to execute. I need to run this condition. That is the reason why I've set the dispatch type as logout. All right. And once this is done, all you need to do is just use the on-click synthetic event listener. And what this should do is it should run do logout. That's it. That's how your profile component should now take care of the logout state. But to actually see this in operation, we'll have to do a couple of other things as well. So I'll have to create a component which allows me to protect certain routes from being accessed if I'm not logged in. So for example, the browser, right? There's nothing in the browser at this time, but the browser should only be available once I'm logged in, because I only want my logged in users to see where we are at. So that's, for example, right now, if I just say Joe and FLIXXIT, okay, I'll go here and let's go to browse separately. And what I want is I want this section to be visible only and only if I am logged in. And once I'm logged in, I should be automatically directed to this page. So there are two components that we'll build now. The first one is route protection. So how do you incorporate route protection? Well, again, use composition, use the rules of React. This is what React is great at. Create components that compose over other components. Okay. So let's create a component here, and I'm going to call this, let's call this protected. Protected sounds about nice. And this component, so export default function called protected. And what this does is, again, it leverages the children prop, which allows me to compose over other components. And the rest of the attributes, I'm going to just get it using the rest operate like this. And what I'm going to do here is I will query the state. I will check to see if the user is present. If the user is present, then I should render whichever component I'm trying to protect, right? Because the presence of a user means that we are logged in. However, if the user is not present in the state, then I should redirect straight to the login page. Okay. So for that, let's first import a couple of things. We'll import use global state, just like how we did in the profile component. We'll import use context, React, and I'm also going to import two components called redirect, and I think let's get route from the React router DOM. Okay, so this is what we're going to use to redirect the user or render the route directly. Inside a component, let's get the context, and let's get the state. All we need is the state. We don't need the dispatch here. Like this. So if state.user is present, we're going to use a ternary operator here. If the user is present, that means that the user is logged in. So if that is the case, then simply return back an instance of the route component and render the children. The use of the rest operator means that I can pass custom props to the protected component, and they'll be passed straight into the route instance. Okay. And you'll see this in operation in just a second, and then you'll understand why we're doing this. Now, since we're using a ternary, for the falsy condition, what we want is we want to use the redirect component, and redirect is a component that comes to us from React Router DOM, and it does what it says. It declaratively allows us to redirect to a given route, and we want to redirect to the login route like this. So that's your protected component. Now let's see how this component can actually be used in practice. So what we'll need to do for that is let's go to the app.js actually, and let's get it in here. So import protected from components dot protected, component slash protected. So once we have the protected component here, the first route that I want to protect is the browse route. Okay. And the way this will function is that instead of creating the route component, all we'll do here is we'll change this from route to protected. Okay. Which means that the browser page can only be accessed if you are logged in. So let me just save this out. And let's try and access this. So you have the login page. Let me manually try, and we are logged out, by the way. Okay, so every time you refresh the browser, you are logged out, because we are not going to build any let's say authentication state persistence in this example, which is a way of saying that once you log in, your authentication token or the presence of the user, are you storing it persistently in the browser somewhere? We are not doing, we're not going to do that, right? So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to avoid doing that. So every time you refresh the page is going to actually log you out. But if I try and access the browse route now, you'll see that the browse page is no longer accessible. Let me try this again. You are redirected to the login page, and the reason it happens is because you are logged out, you're not logged in. So only when you log in should you be able to reach any of the protected routes. So the other components that we're going to create today, those will be protected as well. For example, the video player, the details page, so those will have to be protected as well. And that is where the protected component comes in handy. It just seamlessly allows you to compose over any component that should be displayed only and only when you're logged in. By creating this component, what we've done is the entire logic of authorization, the entire logic of ensuring that you're logged in is composed inside this component, and all that this component does is it renders a route instance if you're logged in, and whatever you pass as a prop. So for example, here we have a prop which says path is equal to /browse. This is going to be directly passed to the instance of the route component here. Okay, that's the reason why we use this. And you could have manually set this to path, right, and have a simple prop here called path. But React Router and the route component, it gives you access to multiple props here. So we don't want to limit the protected component, from being used only for declaring the or setting the path. This should be, you could configure it in any way that you want. So that is why we're just using a simple REST operator here, and this sort of works. So going back to app.js, now one thing that happens, and you'll notice this, is that when you log in, so let's try and log in. When you log in, you're taken to the home page. So essentially, when somebody goes to your website, so let's say something.com, and you only want access to your site only when the user is logged in, you need a mechanism which checks to see if the user is logged in or not. If the user is not logged in, the user should be redirected to the login route. Okay, but if the user is logged in, then instead of rendering a home, it should redirect to your protected areas. Like in our case, it's the browser. Okay, because the browser is protected, the browse route. So what we'll do is we'll create a component which will detect whether we are logged in or not. So I'm just going to call it detect auth.js. Okay, and the intention behind this component is that it should just tell us whether we are actually logged in or not. So once again, the standard things apply here. So import use global state. You'll see how useful this gets now. So once you have a hook in place, your entire state is accessible easily. Import use context, and we'll import redirect because we require redirection. The purpose of this particular component is just to redirect, nothing else. So export default function detect auth, and let's extract the context. And let's extract the state. So once I have this, all I have to do is I have to say if the user is logged in, then redirect to the browse route. As simple as that. But if the user is logged out, then redirect to where? The login route, right? Because we then would want the user to log in. As simple as that. To use this, let's go back to the app.js. Let's bring it here. And instead of rendering any h1 or anything, all we have to do is just say detect auth. That is it. So now you'll see that I'm automatically logged in. So if I just refresh, I'll be logged out. So now I'm logged out. If I refresh, and you'll see I'm straight away taken to the login page. See, if you keep going to the home, keep clicking on home. See, home currently points to the root route. And you could have a purpose for that, right? So the reason why it's there is you could have a purpose for that. You could have something else in place there. That's perfectly fine. In our case, we want our users to be logged in at all times. So when you go to the home, it will take you directly to your login page. And if I log in, see what happens. Instead of going to the home page, it's going to take me straight to the browser. And the reason it is taking me to the browser is because now the detect auth sees that the user is logged in and it takes me here. So now this protected route is accessible. And because you have a protected route, which is always going to keep a check on your user property in the state, what you'll do is if you click on logout, it automatically takes you back to the login page. And the reason it does that is because the moment your state variable user is cleared, your application re-renders. When it does that, your protected route sees that the user is no longer present in the state and it redirects to the login. So this way, all you have to do to implement a logout mechanism is just clear the state. Once you clear the state, your protected component takes up from there and it does the needful. All right, so now we have a good authentication system in place. It does the job that we want. Let's focus our attention on building the browser. So let's log in, and I might need to disable a few things to get things working, but just bear with me. So let's go back to the genre collection, right? So we were here yesterday. We had created some portion of it. However, we still have to query some data. We still have to get a few things in place. Now, this particular section, all that it is doing right now is it accepts an object in the prop called genre, and it renders this frame. This renders this structure where you have the label of the genre, the category, and we have this empty space, which is where the film strip is supposed to appear. Each instance of the genre collection component gets access to one single object or one single genre. So the very first thing I need to do is pull all the movie titles or pull all the data for each category the moment an instance of this component is rendered. In order to do that, let's set up a few things. So I'm going to set up use state and use effect. Why? Because use state will be required to store the data for that genre locally in the instance of the component being rendered, and use effect is going to be used to query the API at the backend, right? So we'll keep this very, very simple in this case. And inside this component, let's first create something called content and set content to enable us to set this, and set this as a blank array. The reason I'm setting this as a blank array is because when movie titles come in, they will come in as a JSON array. So we need an array to store. Next, let's perform a side effect. Let's query our API to pull in the movie titles or the TV show titles in our case based on the genre ID. So the route that we have is /API/list/genre ID, and that should return the data set specific to that genre ID. And to perform a side effect, we can use effect. Okay. Use effect in this case should function or should update only and only when genre.id updates. So it is very important to configure this dependencies array that you have as the second argument to the use effect, because if you don't set this, then any tiny change to the UI and this will rerun. You don't want your API, your endpoint, to be hammered every time there's a tiny UI change in your application. So to restrict the use effect to only when the genre ID changes, and that genre ID would change when multiple instances are being rendered and you have a change in the data set that comes through here. So when that happens, what we need to do is we need to use fetch, and I'm going to use template literals to compose my URL. So /API/list slash, and this is where I want to put genre.id, because that's what I'm getting. Genre is an object which I'm getting in the prop called genre, and I want this to be extracted from there. This will return back data which I want to parse as JSON, that's standard fetch behavior. And once it is parsed, then I want to take that data set and I want to put this in the content state property that we have, right? So this is what we'll do. Now, every time this will execute, every time this refreshes, what will happen is this will pull in data for all the movie titles that you have over here. And this is where you'll have to set up the infinity scroll. This is where you'll have to essentially render multiple instances of this data set that we have over here. Okay, so that's what we are going to do. That will be a slightly complicated process, but try and bear with me and everything should be fine. All right, so let's see, what should we do next? Let's create the movie card component before we get down to anything else. The movie card is the individual titles, as you will see on the UI, right? So before we equip this row or this component with anything else, see what you can do right now is you can say content.map. Content is an array now, right? So content.map, and we get the item, and this is where, let's say, we will say h5, where we'll set the key to item.id, and I think we have item dot, let's see what we are getting from the data set. 1 second. Okay, so we should be able to get a name directly, right? So once I get item.name, yeah, so you can see this one, gigantic string at this time, because of obviously these are all H5s and they are not designed to be put this way. But what is happening is for each and every genre, I am able to query the API at the backend and pull in data. Okay. Now to display this data, we obviously don't need H5s. We need a dedicated component so that we can configure, we can design how that should look like. So let's create that first. So I'm going to create something called Moviecard.js. And the movie card, again, will look like this. And here I'm going to actually have multiple props in place. So I'm going to have name, ID, vote average. So this is all data that is coming from the API. This is nothing specific to React. It's what your API provides, right? So when you're working with the backend, that backend gives you data. So what I'm doing is I'm creating these individual props, individual conduits, which will allow me to pass this data in. Okay. And post a path. Here, we want to return, sorry, we want to return a div with the class name, let's call this movie card. And within this, you will have a structure. So we'll have a div called movie details, which will have the name and other things. So h4 gives you the name like this. Okay, we're using the name for now. But let's make a few other changes. Now, what happens in this particular API that we are using, we have a small problem with the API. And that problem is that in some cases, you will have an image coming in using backdrop underscore path, while in other instances, you'll have the image coming in using poster underscore path. So that's an anomaly that we have in the API. So what I want is I want the image to be displayed. I want whatever image is coming in to be displayed on the movie card. So to work that way around, what we'll do is we'll set a variable called image source, and we'll say if backdrop underscore path is present, then let's use that. Okay. However, if that is not present, then we'll use poster underscore path. So this would be in very, very few cases that your backdrop underscore path is not available. And when that happens, it's going to default to poster underscore path as the source of the image. Then what we'll do is we'll create we'll form an inline style where I'm just going to set background image to URL, and my CDN path, my local static hosting is /images, right? You saw this earlier. And I'm just going to append the img source. So this will give me an inline style, which I can now apply to the movie card, and that should render the images that we have. We are not using an image tag, by the way, in this case. So we're just going to use this. So once we have this in place, then what we'll need to do is we'll need to render instances of this movie card. Again, there are a couple of other things that I'm going to set, but for now, let's go back and let's call this in. And let's see what we get. Movie card component. And instead of the H5, let's render instances of movie card item.id. And for passing in the data that is coming from the item object from the array, I'm just going to spread this out. So when you do this, it's going to automatically create props for every property in the object that is coming through here. You don't have to manually configure your props like this, right? Because the name of the prop is the same as the name of the property coming in through the object. So once you save this, essentially what will happen is you're going to see this, right? Can you see this? So we have our film strip in place. One second, let me just spread this out. We have our film strip in place, and I can actually scroll this left and right individually. And when I hover the mouse, it shows me the name of the title as well. This is all CSS, by the way, right? So this is not any fancy JavaScript. This is plain simple style sheets, CSS, nothing else. We just have a div here which shows up only when I hover, nothing else. So let's try and equip this a little bit more and see if we can render more data on this movie card, instead of just this. We need a play button. We need a button which takes us to the detail route. So let's bake that in. So let me actually go to the movie card. And the next thing I want is I want a link to the play button, and I want link to a page called details. To do that, I'm going to import some icons. Remember, we had React icons installed in this project. So let's import some icons. That will be BS play fill. So this, as I had explained earlier, is nothing related to React. This is a third-party package which is available. You can go to the React icons website and you can see a catalog of all the icons. You can pick an icon that you want, and you can just import that straight as a component inside your application, right? So that makes life very, very simple. And we want a link here. So I'm going to get the link component from React router DOM. Okay, so we get both these things in place, and then all we have to do is we'll say create a link, and our link is supposed to be to slash play. We have not created this route yet, but we'll do that. Slash play slash, and you would want to pass the ID of the title that you want to play. Now, this in our case is not going to result in any drastic change. We'll still play the same video clip for brevity purposes because we just have one clip in place for demo. But in a real scenario, what you're doing here is you're passing the ID of the title that you want to play to this route, and this data can then be extracted in that route and can be used to fetch that specific video from your system, right? So that's what we're doing. Inside the play button, let's render the BS play fill component which we brought in, and I'm just going to set the class name to play btn because this allows us to render this correctly. So let's say this out, and when you hover the mouse now, you'll see a play button. See, this play button comes here. So if I click on the play button, you'll notice that we have the ID of the title being appended to the URL, and this is something that we can extract. As I was saying, this is something that we can extract easily in the player. So every time I go, you'll see a different ID over here. Okay, might be a little difficult to see because the size is a little small, but I hope this makes sense. All right, one second. So what else? Let's create more stuff here. So now I want to also render the details page slash details. Again, this route we have not created as yet, so we'll do that. And this is one of those routes where we'll actually make use of the ID that we are passing. So this is BS chevron up icon, and set the class name to details btn. Save this out, and you get this, right? So we have a play button, we have this. Now in the actual UI, there's also a small rating widget here. There's a rating which shows up. So let's try and create that rating. So for the rating, let's create a separate component because we want to reuse this. We want to reuse this component wherever we have to show the rating for the user for the title. So for this purpose, I'll say export default function rating, and this accepts two things: score, and there's something called style, right? So style basically will let us dynamically adjust the CSS for this component if required. Okay, we want to give that flexibility, and you'll see why we use that when we get to the details component. For now, we'll keep things very simple. We'll say return if score is greater than 0, then we'll render div with the class name rating, and we'll simply pass on the style like this for now, right? So if there's nothing, then it won't render anything. Now inside this div, I want to render stars, like how you see star rating, right? So star can be had as an icon. Let's import it from the React icons package. And what we'll do is we'll use a simple JavaScript thingy to get this done. I'm going to use array from with array math.floor. We'll turn the incoming data will divide it by 2 because the value of the score is going to be between 0 and 10. 0 and 10. So we want to divide it so that we get a score between 0 to 5 typically. So we'll simply divide this for the sake of simplicity. Once I get this array in place, then what we'll do is we'll map this, and in the map, I don't need the first property, I just need the index, and let's use this to render instances of your star fill component. Set the class name to rating stars. This is only so that it can be rendered correctly. You must set the key attribute to the index in this case. Now, normally we don't use index, but in this case, this data is not going to change. So it's perfectly fine to use the index here. And we have this. And along with this, I will also render an H4 where we'll specify the number. So whatever score we have, let's specify the number as well. Okay, so here's our rating component, as simple as that. Now to use this rating component, let's go back to the movie card and let's get it. So BS Play, I think I do not require this. Sorry, wrong import. Import rating from rating, and then what we want to do is we just want to render. I think below the H4 is a good place to render. We'll render this rating. I'm going to set the score to this data that we are getting called vote average. This data is coming from the API, vote average, right? So now let's see what we get. See this? Here we don't have this data, so nothing renders. But wherever you have data, you're going to see the number of stars between, let's say, 0 to 5, and you're going to see the actual value as well. That's your rating component. And this is reusable. We're going to use this in a while when we render the details page. All right, so what is up next? Now let's do a few things. I'm going to make a few changes to, let's close everything. I'm going to make a few changes to the CSS that we have. See, we want to get rid of these bars. We don't want them because we want to build an infinity scroll feature, which will get the job done. But I think before I do that, let me finish the details in the player page so that at least that is done and we are left only with the infinity scroll, because the infinity scroll can get a little daunting to work with. It will take some time. So let's keep things very simple. Let's just work on the details and the player page for now. Let's finish that and then we'll come back to the infinity scroll feature. So let's first create the details page. The details page is going to be quite straightforward. Let's get details.js. Okay. Here, details. And remember what happens when you click on this. When you click, you get /details/ and the ID. So we want to extract the ID somehow from this route and then query the database to get the details of that particular title. That's the task at hand. So in order to do that, the very first thing that we'll do is go back to our app.js, and we haven't defined the route as yet, right? So it's showing me something, but it's not obviously showing me what I need to see. So let's create a protected route where we have /details, and now you can do a slash and you can express a URL parameter. This parameter is what will allow us, think of it as a variable, which will allow us to fetch the portion of the URL where this ID appears, right? So this is what we're doing. And we want to render the details component. So import details from components details, and all you will do is you will just say details, nothing else. That's it. So now we are actually rendering the details page, and here in the details page what we're going to do is let's also get layout See, composition makes your life very easy, right? So when we have layout, you can be sure that you will get the base layout every time. So let's do a show of FLIXXIT, and let's click on the details page. Now this is the details page. You can see that the layout is giving us what we need. Our user is logged in, so I'm getting the username and the logout button as well, and the behavior remains the same. So at any point of time you click on logout, you'll be taken to the login page straight away, right? Because this is a protected route. All right, let's import a few other things. Let's import the use params hook and the link hook from React router DOM. Use params is going to be very interesting. What this does is this will allow us to directly extract the ID from the URL parameter. What is this ID? This ID is what we expressed as :ID here. As simple as that. Instead of ID, if you want to name it something else, be my guest. This is just a variable name, and you can directly pull into your component like this. So that's how simple it gets, when you're working with React and when you're working with these amazing packages like React Router. All right. Next, I'm going to get use state, use effect, because again, we're going to perform a side effect. We're going to pull this data from the backend. We require this. We also want, by the way, the rating components. I'm just going to import it, and we can then use it going forward. So I have the ID with me. I'm going to set a variable which will store the data once we fetch from the API. Okay, we are pulling in details of a particular title. So now let's pull in the data. Use effect, fetch, and slash API slash details slash, let's pass in the ID. So we are just passing the ID to the slash API slash details route, which has been designed specifically to provide us with the details of a given title. And then once we have the data in place, we'll just set this to, the details state variable that we have created. And this should happen every time that the ID changes. So ID in this case is the URL parameter ID. So this is the optimization that you have to implement. Otherwise, you might run into a lot of issues. So now we are setting this, and we have this data. And what we'll say is that you render the layout, you render everything only and only and only if the details are present. So the easiest way to do that is this. So only when the details is not empty, it's not, in fact, we are setting this to null when we create the state property called details. When this is null, nothing will render out of this component, but when this has some data in, it will render that content. So now let's design the page. So here we want a div called details panel, which we have created for this purpose, within which we have two things. We have an image and we have another div which carries all the text related details. So let's create that first. Inside this, render an h1 with details.name. So let's see if this comes to life. See, Superman and Lois. So it starts to work. Then we want the rating component. So here you can see a great case of reusability where I am repurposing the component we created earlier for displaying the rating. So it displays the rating. The only thing is it's supposed to be more closer to the title. So to get that thing working, what we'll do is we'll now make use of the style attribute that we created. So I'm going to go into the style attribute, and what we'll do is we'll just simply pass in an inline style, and this inline style, because it's present, is going to be applied directly. So I'm able to position this component a little better. Remember that this is optional. You don't have to set this. But if you are setting this will allow you to change and modify the placement position of your rating component. So give me a second. All right, moving forward, what else can we render here? So let's put a paragraph tag and let's render details.overview, and this will give us a summary of this specific title. We'll also put a button here, which is a link tag, because we had imported the link tag, /play, because we want the user to be able to go straight to the player from this particular section directly. And let's put the name play here. I'm going to also set the class name, which I've created for this purpose, called play btn. This will give us a play button, right? So you can see the UI come to life straight away. And outside this div, I'm going to put a regular image tag where we'll use /images. That's the, remember, that's the static route that we have for images, and we want poster underscore path in this particular case. So we are dynamically setting the source attribute. Always set the alternate attribute here, and you should get the image also. There you go. So that's our details page, right? So I can, from here, I can go back to the home. You can go to a particular title, you can click on details, you'll get the details. Now you can see that the data is being pulled from the API specifically for the purposes of being displayed here. And we have a play button which should take us to the player. So let's make the player quickly before we get back to infinity scrolling, which will be the last thing that we build. So let's create player.js, and for the player, all we require is the video URI. Okay, now remember, player is two things. Player is the isolated component which will just render the HTML5 player. On the other hand, we have another component which actually fetches the video URL. So we'll have to create that as well. So first, let me just quickly create a base player here. Now, when the video URI is present, at that point in time, what we need to do is render a div with the class name FLIXXIT layer. Okay, like this. Export default function layer, sorry. And this is video URI. So it will render a container called FLIXXIT player. Inside this, I'm going to create a simple HTML5 video element. Set this to video player. We want controls. We want to set the source to video URI so that it plays directly from the URL. And we want this to autoplay as well. Okay, that's what we have. We'll build a couple of other things in a moment. But the first thing that I want to do is get this up and running. In order to do that, we'll create the video fetching logic separately. And again, I'm doing this simply because you don't need to do this. Actually, you can just put the entire mechanism in the player. But the benefit that it gives you in React is that you can separate the logic. You can separate the video fetching logic, or the logic that fetches the data for the video clip. You can separate that completely. This allows you to create, let's say tomorrow you want to create multiple versions of the player. You can just use the fetch video universally across all your platforms. because all that it does is it fetches the data, the URL for the video, and passes it on to the player. That player could be your mobile player, it could be your smart TV player, it could be your player for the browser, anything. That could be anything. But you have the flexibility of separating that logic. So we'll say fetch video, render the children. We use composition, and first up we need to fetch this data. So and remember again, data comes in the form of an ID, like so. We'll set the route in just a second. Okay, so let me build this first, and we'll say video, set video, use state, set to null, get the ID, which will pass in the URL, and then use effect to query the API. So what is the API? Slash API slash video slash ID. That's the URL which has to be sent the ID so that it can return back that specific video clip. In our case, it is going to send back the same video clip, an open source, free for all video clip that we have. We are using that as an example, and then set it to the video. And this should change when the ID changes. So always make sure that you implement this optimization. Once we have this data, so once we have video in place, all that you do is you render your children props, which is obviously going to be a function component. Okay, it's going to be a component. You render this and you can pass in the video data directly to that component, right? So that's how simple your service gets. So think of this component as a service, which all that it does is it looks at the URL, fetches the video, and that's about it. Now let's see how this can be used when we define our route. So in our app.js, let's bring both of these things in. So let's bring in fetch video, and I'm going to also get player, like this. Okay, now let's create a protected path. So path is equal to slash play slash ID. Once again, we are using the same mechanism. When that happens, we'll say fetch video. Okay, and fetch video will pull the ID from the URL parameters, will do the needful, and then we'll get access to the video. And this is where we render the player. As simple as that. And to pass data to the player, we'll just say video. That is it. That's all you need to do. So now if I click on play, what happens is you'll see a tiny version of the player come up here. And if I hit the play button, this will just play a simple clip, right? So we'll make some changes to the interface here. Not much though. Right. So now we can easily go back to the player and implement a few other tiny things that we want. So let's go back. Okay, so we want a back button, by the way. We want a button which allows us to take the users back. Again, an icon is sufficient. And we need a link. So let's put that over here. Like this. In fact, Link is not exported from React icons. Oh, sorry. This thing is React router DOM. Okay, so this should give us this button. The problem with this button is that this button is always visible. We don't want that to happen. So let's make a few changes. I'm going to get use effect and use state, first of all, and you see why. Show back button, set show back button. So by default, we actually do not want this to be shown. Okay, we want this to be visible only when the user sorry, only when the user hovers their mouse over the video. Only then we want to show this button, like how typically you will find in players like Netflix, right? So let's see how that can be done. Now, to do that, we again require synthetic events. So on the FLIXXIT player, we can say on mouse over, on mouse over, simply run a function which says set show back btn to true. And when our mouse goes out, we can set show back btn to false. Okay, so this will toggle the show back button. How do we use this? Well, what we can do here is we can use inline style. Now there are many ways of getting this done, but you could just simply control the rendering of this conditional rendering, which is also perfectly okay. But I'm just going to use conditional switching of styles, okay, just as a way of showing you how this is done. So show back btn, if this is the case, set display to block, okay, or else set display to none. So inline styles being affected by a state property. See this, okay. Now one problem that I will see, one problem that we have is that the size of the player should actually fit to the window, which is not happening. And what if the window is resized? So how do we take care of that? So that can also be done very easily. So let's do that. We have the use effect, which we brought in. And the reason I have this is because I want to be able to find the width of the window and adjust the height of my video element accordingly, right? It's quite easy, actually. It's not difficult. First thing you need to do, remember that React uses virtual DOM, which means that all the elements are not in the DOM at all times. They are in, I mean, they are computed. The changes to the elements are computed in memory first before they're applied to the DOM. So as a result, we have a mechanism which allows us to access the actual node inside the DOM, and we'll use that. So in this case, I'm going to get another hook called use ref, okay, or a reference. And what this does is this will allow me to reach out to the actual DOM. So let's get the video element first. Set it like this, use ref, and then we'll go to the video and we'll set the ref property to video el. This will now allow me to use DOM manipulation to manipulate the size of this video dynamically. And I should do that inside a use effect. So in use effect, what we'll do is run a function which allows you to change the width. So I'll create that function. Let me just create that separately. It's called set dimensions. You could create that inside, I mean, you could put that functionality inside, but it's better to create that separately. So here we'll get the inner width, inner height of the window. Okay, this you can have from the window object directly. And when you get this, you would want to set the width attribute on your video to the inner width, and likewise the height to the inner height. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually setting the width and the height properties to the width and the height properties of the window. So this will do the job if you run this for the very first time when the page is loaded. So let's say set dimensions. And once the player loads, you can see that it automatically does the job. It does the needful and it scales the window. But what if you rescale now? See what happens? It's not dynamically resizing. It should dynamically resize my player as I'm changing the size of the window. It should try and do that as needed. So that's also quite easy to do. You don't need to really do much. All you have to do is use window.add event listener, because you need to put the event listener on the window. So we are going to use window.event listener, and we'll say resize and run set dimensions. Okay, and if you're doing this, the other important thing to do is that every time this component is destroyed, you need to do something called as a cleanup, which is done like this. A cleanup basically means that if you've created an event listener, then you must remove that event listener as well. Okay, so this is very, very important to prevent memory leaks, and you must do that. So let's set this, and hopefully this should work. Yep, see this? So now as I change the window, it will resize. We have our back button, which takes us to the page over here. Let's go here, let's click on play, and we have our video player, which sort of does the needful, right? That's our player. So now the last thing that we have to implement is our scroll feature. So let's try and do that as much as possible. This is going to get a little complicated, but please try and bear with me. All right, so we are going to use something called as React Spring. So React Spring is a package which lets you implement physics style animations quite easily. So it has a built-in API which lets you do the needful. Just give me a second. Hope I'm audible and clear. All right. So we are in our, let's go into our genre collection here, and we have a couple of things that you see. We have a row, we have a translate row, and all that. So let's try and again bring infinity scroll as a composition. So first thing, let's set up infinity scroll as a component which composes over your movie cards, right? So here, let's say export default function infinity scroll, and it'll get access to the children prop again. In terms of the return, we want to return back the row div within which we want to return back the translate row. Remember, we currently have this set up in the genre collection. We'll get rid of that. Okay, we'll replace this. We'll get rid of that, and we want to put it here. Think of it as a container, right? So what we want is we want 3 instances of the film strip to be rendered, so that even if it is small, we have sufficient width so that it covers the entire width of the page, and you can scroll left and right. And we want to bring it right in the center. So what we want is you want to bring it right in the center somewhere here, and every time that it scrolls beyond a certain threshold, we want to revert back to the starting point in such a way that you barely notice. You will not notice, right? So that's what the spring will do. it will keep the scroll going back. So if you scroll in this direction, it'll go to a certain point, it'll again reset back, it'll go to a certain point, it will reset back, it will go to a certain point, it will reset back. It'll just keep on doing that. And if you scroll in this direction, again, it's going to do the same thing. But for that to happen, what we want is we want 3 instances of this film strip and the scroll bar set to the middle instance, right? So that we have stuff on the left, we have stuff on the right, so that you can scroll to, and by the time you reach the end of that scroll, you are again reverted back right in the center. That's what is going to be the core logic behind the infinity scroll. So for this purpose, we'll need a couple of things. First of all, I would need to set a div. Now, in this case, I can't use the fragment because I need details of I need physical components inside. So I need 3 instances of the div here, and 3 instances of our children. So whatever you pass in here will be rendered one after the other 3 times. Okay, this is the first requirement. Second, let's get a few things in place. So I'm going to get from the React Spring package, let's get use Spring animated config use Spring ref. And this div, this middle one, this div should be set to something called as an animated div. You can do that like so. So this now allows React Spring to take control of this translate row div, right? But for this to work correctly, I need to make a few changes to my CSS. So I'm just going to go back to the CSS and let's see, we want to make a few changes here. Now this is the row div which we are working with currently. I want to get rid of the overflow thing out. This is not required. In the translate row, I don't need to set the width. Let's get rid of this. This is not required. You'll see some weird looking changes, so we'll just fix this in a moment. But we want to get rid of this, and we want to also hide the scroll bar, which is already hidden right now. So let's get rid of all this. We are done. Now we can get back to our example. So the next thing that I want to do is, once I have this in place, I also want to create my scroll buttons, the buttons which will allow me to scroll left and right. Okay, let's quickly create that as a separate component. One single component will do the job. Scroll button.js. And the reason I'm doing this is because this will avoid any clutter inside the infinity scroll component, because it's going to get a pretty decent amount of code inside. So export default function scroll button. We will set the on click handler, and we'll have a property called direction. Okay, so another prop called direction, and the idea is simple. So if direction is equal to left, render the button for the left, else render the button for the right. So one single component can do the job for us. And I'm going to import 2 icons which will represent this. So bs fill caret left fill, bs fill caret right fill from React icons slash, I think this is bootstrap, right? Bootstrap icons. So now we'll render bs fill caret left fill with the ID set to left scroll, class name set to scroll btns, and if it's the other side, right fill with set to right scroll, class name scroll btns, like this. Okay, and the on click which is going to pass this on directly. So on click if set is whatever function I'm setting in the prop. do the same thing here. So that's how quickly you can set up your scroll buttons, because we don't want to clutter up our infinity scroll function as is. And we'll import them here. So import scroll button from scroll button like this. And in the row, let's render them. So let's say scroll button direction is equal to left. Okay. And scroll button direction. In fact, direction is not required. So if direction is not present, it's just going to give you the right button. And hopefully this should render the left and the right buttons here. Let's just see if we have any kind of errors in place. Okay, these are again API related issues, but yeah, we should get the buttons in place. I think let's finish this component, then we'll get the buttons to view. Right now the entire UI is compressed, so you will not be able to see anything visually. So let's continue working, build this and set the size and everything correctly. Now I'm going to import use state, use ref once again, use effect from React. Okay, so what we want to do first is our content is any of these divs. Now in this case, I'm going to use the middle one as my source of content. Okay, so we'll set the ref as content ref, which we can then create first. Content ref is equal to use ref. I can see a question which says, will the recording be shared? Yes, it will be shared on our YouTube channel, and we'll mail that across to you as well. All right, so we have a ref. Now, ref means that you have a connection, you have a hook to this instance of the film strip that we are rendering here, right? So you have a hook onto this, and once we have this hook, what we can do is we can identify, understand the actual width of this film strip. Okay, and to do that, we'll use a use effect. Here we'll say if content ref dot current is how you access anything in the ref. So if that is the case, then we can access the offset width, the actual width of this. And when that happens, what I want to do is I want to set a state property. Let's set this as okay. Let's call this width. Use state sets to 0. So if this is the case, then we'll set width to content ref, which is the middle instance of the film strip, dot current dot offset width, right? We'll do this. And now that we have our use effect working, let's also make sure our optimization is in place. Let's also bring in our set spring or spring. So the spring, React Spring actually provides us with a hook called use spring, which you can use. Now imagine a spring. All of you have seen how springs look like, right? You have a point, you have 2 points in a spring. So let's say we anchor 1 point and we have the second point, which we can use to do the animation. So what I'm going to do is get a scroll value and a set spring. So this works a little bit like use state, but what I can do here is I can configure my custom properties. So I'm going to configure a property which says from. So imagine this is the starting point from where you want the animation to run, which you're going to set as 0. And there's something called config. So I'm just going to set this as config.molasses. You don't need to worry about this. Basically, this is the style of animation that you will get when you hit one of the buttons to scroll left and right, right? So you don't need to worry about this right now. you'll see this in action, and then you'll understand what we're talking about. So what we're doing is we are setting, we are using this, and we'll say set spring. So when the page loads up, when it loads up the content, is going to run the set spring dot set function, and it's going to set the scroll value to the middle of the film strip, and we'll say content ref dot current dot offset width, like this. Okay. So this is the first thing that I want to do. What next? What next? Let's see. And we want to also change this when set spring changes. Okay. So you want to set the width. We want to do all this. The animated div that we have over here will also get its own ref, but we want to access this using a special version of useRef called useSpringRef, which comes from setSpring, because the animated div is a special component which comes to us from React Spring. So we want to grab hold of the internal DOM element here, and we want to action this using the React Spring API. So we'll set it like so. Scroll ref. This does the needful. And what we'll also do is, let's see, scroll left. So how do you animate the scroll value? You just animate it like this. Okay, you animate the scroll value directly using the scroll value. So the scroll value can be used directly over here. So this is one part of the setup that we are doing. The next part of the setup would be let's see. I want to build a function which allows me to implement the scroll. So let's say scroll handler, and this will be an async function. Okay. Like this. So before we do anything further, I think it would be good to go back to the genre collection and implement, because otherwise we won't be able to see any effect on the UI. I've not used this here. So how can we see this in action? Infinity scroll from infinity scroll like this, and I think I'll get rid of these two, grab this, we'll say infinity scroll, put this inside, and yeah, this should basically give you the feature. So see, the buttons have come to life. I have the buttons in place. If I hit the buttons, nothing happens yet because we haven't built the handler for the buttons, right? So once you click on the button, something should happen. But yeah, our UI is very much in place now. The strip looks perfect. So let's go back to the infinity handler, infinity scroll, and let's work on the scroll handler. We're almost done with this, by the way. All we need to do is implement the logic which will actually do the scroll for you. And then I'll explain how this is all going to come together and how this works, if you're getting confused right now, because this part of the entire thing can be a bit daunting to understand, but just bear with me and I'll explain. So scroll handler is the function which will run when you hit one of the scroll buttons, either the left or the right. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to get the current value of scroll val. So think of the scroll val as a variable which will control how much your div actually scrolls. So the film strip, the set of film strips that you have, the three film strips side by side that you have, they are right in the center. How do you move them left or right? You move them left or right by using the scroll val property, right? Currently, we have the scroll val as a part of the spring, but it's not getting animated. How do you animate? You simply set the value. And to do that, we'll first get the value in the handler, and then we'll compute how much we want to scroll, right? And that's pretty simple. So we'll say computed scroll. We'll take the value and we'll compute the modulus because we don't want any, floating point values there typically. And then we'll add width. Okay, what is width? Width is this. Okay, so you add this width, and that's what gives us this width is set once the film strip is loaded in for the first time. You get a width of the actual film strip. So you basically add this on, and this will compute the amount of scroll. And then you will run set spring dot set. So there are two APIs here. There is set spring dot set, and there is set spring dot start. Set is going to simply instantly set the value to the computed scroll. Okay. Whereas set spring dot start will cause the actual scroll to happen. And in order to do that, we'll set the scroll value. Remember, scroll value is the property that we are animating in this entire function, in this entire component. That's all we are doing. And we are saying that if the direction is, in this case, if the direction is true, which will happen when we click on the left button, if the direction is true, then you simply take the computed scroll value and you minus the offset. So offset is going to be something like 800. Now this is a number that you can set on your own, right? Or else we'll say computed scroll val plus 800. So there's no logic behind 800 other than the fact that I'm using this as a number which I think is in this case works well, right? You can of course change this computed scroll val. See, I'm making mistakes already. There you go. Now 800, instead of hard coding it here, just make a simple variable. I mean, in this case, a constant. You can set this to anything. That this is the amount by which this will scroll, right? There you go. Now, how do you get this working? Last step, on click. So when the buttons are pressed, we have our scroll handler. But we're going to use bind because I need to pass in an optional true or false. So this is what will happen. When this is true, we are saying take the scroll value wherever you are, the film strip, minus 800 pixels so that it animates in that direction. So if it's the left button, then subtract. If it's the right button, then nothing. I mean, then just it's false anyway. That's it. So let's see if this works. There you go. So every time that I hit the button, the value of the offset is going to be either added or subtracted. When that happens, the React Spring gets into action and gives you this animation rather than just jumping to that particular point. It gives you this animation. And now, just to give you an idea of what Infinity Scroll was all about, keep an eye on this particular title, Rick and Morty. Okay, this is the first one. I'm going to keep scrolling. There's Rick and Morty again. There's Rick and Morty again. So you can keep on going, you can keep on going, you can keep on going. This will be infinite. And you can do the same on this side as well. All right. And we have the play button, by the way, which takes us to the player straight away. We have the player, which can be accessed directly from this. Go back and we'll reach this point. And of course, you can click on logout and you reach the login page. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. So let's have some questions. Thank you so much for taking out time yesterday and today to attend this webinar. I hope this was useful. This gave you a little glimpse into what React is capable of and how you can create a simple minimum viable uh, clone, if you may, of something like Netflix. And of course, we also covered a lot of other things. We also covered things like composition. We also covered things like routing, how to create your own hook for managing the state, context, and several other critical React concepts, right? We'd love to hear from you. So please do share your feedback with us. Please do write to us. And we hope to see you soon in one of our courses, perhaps. Thank you so much.